Oh, all right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Plymouth Congregational Church, Minneapolis, Minnesota Sunday Forum. Happy to have you here. Thanks to the audience that are here live with us. And thank you also to our remote audience for joining us this morning. We appreciate your being here with us. Our program this morning is part of Plymouth's Immigration Sunday. It's to help all of us be more awake to the immigrants all around us, to do a better job of seeing the world through their eyes, and to the extent possible, helping achieve justice in the world for them. We have many, many wonderful visitors here with us today. We have musicians and cooks and ministers and people from all over the country who are joining us, and actually all over the world. So thank you very much for being with us this morning. Please hold any questions you have until the end. We have a number of people giving slightly longer and slightly shorter presentations this morning. So we'll have time. We will make sure we have time for questions at the end. It's now my pleasure to introduce Reverend Dr. Delle Mccormick. She's been exploring liberation theologies and being church in the Borderlands since 1989. So that's a long time if you stop to think about it. She's had a rich career in leading cross-border experiences, including Plymouth Church's experience in 2020, and she will be leading our group again in 2023. More details on her life and career available on the Plymouth website on the Sunday Forum tab. Delle currently volunteers at Casas Welcome Center for asylum seekers in Tucson, where some of our 2023 border trip participants will be volunteering. Delle will be speaking about how faith community immersion experiences can enrich and build relationships through visits on both sides of the border, including shelters for migrants and asylum seekers, churches ministering at the border, and local organizations committed to border ministries. Two participants in Plymouth's 2020 border trip, John Schenk, Jane Thompson, will share highlights of from their group, the process that their group went through, and their on-the-ground learning. I will briefly share some work Delle helped us get involved in as a follow-up to our 2020 trip. Welcome, Delle.
Thank you. Good morning. It's so great to see you. Your church is well known on the border as one that not only went to the border and saw, but has affected really positive change at the border since. So, when I told people I was coming up to speak at Plymouth, they said, "Oh, that's the church that helped build the men's dorm on the border on the Mexico side." So thank you for your participation and for your interest. It was 1989. I was living in Upper Manhattan on the Upper West Side, and I went on what's called a reverse mission trip with my Quaker Buddhist Presbyterian church. I'd never been on a mission trip before, and I just fell in love with this church and the preaching of the pastor and the people. So I decided to jump in. I'd never been anywhere with Bible carrying Christians before, but I went on the trip. At the time, reverse mission was a relatively new concept, and it was about not going into a place and converting the people there, or building for them or helping them do things that they could do themselves, but to be converted and come home and change ourselves and our lives and our world on this side of the border. So that's what I did. The program was based on Paulo Freire's See, Judge, Act, where we went into squatter settlements and different communities, impoverished communities, but also talked with social justice organizers, faith communities, and otherwise. And that was my first taste of Mexico, and I fell in love. I ended up being ordained to go back there to be the director of the Cuernavaca Center for Intercultural Dialog on Development, where we did these kind of immersion experiences that your folks went on a regular basis for people from Canada and the United States. But we started to look at how, when we would go into communities, the question that people always ask is, where's their hope? And they would say, go back and change the world. But they started to think about and feel angry that our folks did go back and change their world and came back and said, oh yeah, I came on a mission trip 2 years ago and this is what I did. But the people we visited stayed the same. Their conditions stayed the same. So we began to look at a mission model where both sides of the border were inspired and moved to act in new, generous ways together. So I was in Mexico in 1997, working at the Center for in Cuernavaca. When the free trade agreement went into effect in 1997, we know now that the United States knew that that would result in massive immigration from Mexico to the US border because the influx of multinational corporations, of Costco and McDonald's and all of the big well-financed businesses would run the mom and pop businesses out of business. And so almost immediately after that, about 500,000 people started migrating towards the United States because it wasn't working. A band of maquiladoras or factories were built in the middle of Mexico to be a sort of a sponge to attract indigenous people off of their land in the south of Mexico so it could be developed. But it wasn't enough for them to really support their families. So we began to see this really massive immigration, mainly from Mexico and from Central America. We also began then militarizing our border in 1997 with all kinds of operations to build walls, not just the wall that you think of, but the whole digital, being able to spot people through infrared cameras that could see whether they're carrying weapons, how many people, male or female, etc., but all different kinds of other walls that would keep people out of the United States. Motion detectors in the desert. We also began seeing a huge number of people getting lost and some of those bodies being recovered. We know that in the past year, almost 1,000 bodies have been recovered, remains have been recovered, but the Sonoran Desert is so big and bodies become ashes very fast because of the conditions of the desert that many, many bodies are not recovered. So we know that, and we have known for a long time that what most people call migrants, I've come to call them people in situations of forced migration, because that says really who they are. And that can be a migrant who's fleeing and coming to the United States without documents to work sort of under the table, right? And kitchens and gardening and that kind of work. It's the story has so many faces to me. I'm likely to fall into them as I'm talking to you. And then there's the other kind of person that we're seeing more and more often, and those are the asylum seekers, people who international law says that they have the right to cross the border and say that they're seeking asylum, and we have the responsibility of taking them through that process. However, in more recent days, Title 42 has been enacted during the Trump administration to stop people who it was thought would spread COVID from Mexico and Central America, when really our COVID statistics were higher than those countries. But since the Trump administration, people from Mexico and Central America have been stopped at the border and repatriated or deported immediately without even being able to ask for asylum. And now we're seeing more people from other countries, which may change soon, and I'll talk about that in a minute. In 2014, well, I want to talk first of all about my first experience in the desert. I'd come back from Cuernavaca and from San Cristóbal de las Casas, where I served as a UCC missionary in partnership with the Catholic Diocese of San Cristóbal. Came back and itinerated through 17 states, and I found myself in Tucson and went out with Reverend Randy Mayer, which those of you who've been on the been on the border trip with Plymouth, have met him. He's been deeply involved on the border since he got there. He took me out to on a border run with Humane Borders, where they put these bright blue barrels of water out in the middle of the desert, where there's nothing or no one, but there's a flag. And so folks who are migrating without documents, not seeking asylum, cross, and they can see these water barrels and fill up their water with clean water. And that has saved a number of lives. But we were out there in the middle of the desert, and I saw this tiny handprint in this desert sand. And I said to Randy, oh, why would a little child be out here in the middle of the desert? And his answer to me was, how far would you go to feed your child? I'll always remember that, because more and more we see people coming up from countries from all over the world, this massive hemorrhage south to north of people who are migrating because they can't sustain life where they are. We used to see tons of what was called migrant trash in the Sonoran Desert, and now Humane Borders keeps track of the number of people who are lost and they're looking for, and the remains that are found. But there has been an increase of people in the past couple of years. The border is open to certain people and not to others, and that's generally lighter skinned people who have higher degrees of education. I ended up moving to Tucson to work at Borderlinks, which is an educational advocacy group that also does these kinds of border immersion experiences. And then I went on to serve 2 local churches there. We opened a shelter for asylum seekers in my church. And I got in a lot of trouble saying that church is shelter and shelter is church, because there's still a lot of people who don't see church as shelter, not for those people, right? So I ended up leaving and retiring and working for CAPACITAR, which serves asylum seekers who have come through the legal process and have asked for asylum and have been allowed to ask for asylum, that then come to our shelter, where we provide shelter, a shower, food, tender loving care. And we have gone from receiving 350 people a day to COVID, where we would receive maybe 6 or 7 people a day. And that was happening, starting to happen as the group from Plymouth was down there. I think we had very, very few people. We moved to a smaller shelter. We're now back up to the point where one day we had 900 people in our facilities. We have 4 shelters now, the Welcome Center, where everybody comes through. If you can imagine 900 people coming through in a day, and then they go out to hotels if they're COVID positive. They have to stay for 5 days after they've had symptoms before they can move on. I want to talk today, though, about a new, it's not really new, because I remember back 3 or 4 years ago that people talked about coming through the Darien Gap. And I don't know if you read the New York Times article today on the Darien Gap. I think it was in today's paper, or yesterday or the day before. It's hard to know when you look at the digital, but there's a really excellent article about the Darien Gap. It makes the Sonora Desert look like kindergarten as far as how people get through it. So let's see. The Darien Gap is a 60-mile area between Panama and Colombia. It is basically uninhabited. There are no roads there, and they've tried to build the highway that goes from South America up to North America, and it's been stopped twice for environmental reasons. But now people are, I know that I'm coming off mic here, but I just want to show you, they often start here and take a boat to the middle of the Darien Gap, which helps a little bit. It's not quite as dangerous, although many people drown because the boats, of course, are overloaded and they capsize. And so that is the journey that people are embarking on now from Uzbekistan and Georgia and all the nations in Africa and Ecuador and Peru and Colombia and Venezuela. The article in the New York Times was primarily about Venezuelans. And the number of people from those countries has increased dramatically. And that is, we are barely seeing anybody from Mexico and Central America now because of Title 42 holding them back. But we are seeing many, many people who make this trek. So this is the beginning. I spoke to a young man named Anderson, who I was called in as a psychological support team coordinator to meet with him. He had witnessed his sister drowning as they started that one place that I showed you by the ocean. She couldn't swim, went into bathed, and two men tried to save her, and everybody drowned. So he buried her on the beach, if you can imagine, and then left with his partner, a woman, to come through the Darien Gap. He told me he was like the most haunted person I've ever met. And I've met a lot of folks who've come through difficult situations. He said that walking through this gap, they saw a lot of bodies of children and pregnant women. And so I wanted to show you, this is one family, I think it was a family, an extended family of 13. She is a nurse. It shows the amount of mud that they walk through for most of the days that they're in the Darien Gap. That's Olga Ramos and her family. Next slide, please. This is as they're beginning the journey. It looks pretty nice, you know, there's that ground cover there to walk up. You can see that people are carrying tents, lots of stuff on their back, which they begin to toss as things get more difficult. Next slide, please. This is a man with his child resting, shows the anguish and exhaustion of that journey. This is a polluted river, and this is what they used to call migrant trash, what people get rid of, you know, as they're traveling with, they can't carry it anymore, or maybe they are injured. If you're injured, you die in the Darien Gap. There is no one to rescue you. Next slide. This is a man with a prosthesis. We see folks on crutches, on wheelchairs, in wheelchairs, going through the Darien Gap. This is right before they begin their journey. Next slide. Again, just mud, mud, and more mud. It gets a large amount of rain every year, and there's really no dry season. This is a pregnant woman, Johanna Sierra. She lost her grip going down the mountain, and she was pregnant, and she lost her baby at the bottom. Yeah. So this is about halfway, and they're looking off and what, you know, they still have to go through. You know, the Sonoran Desert is horrible and hot, and there are a lot of humanitarian groups out there looking for people and providing water, and Border Patrol looking for them, and all kinds of rescues, and not nearly enough. But this is the worst that I have ever seen. I think that's the last slide. So people say, where's the hope? And you're it. You're the hope. Because these days, in the countries where people are leaving, life is unsustainable because of climate change, because of exploitation of what they call gente desechable, disposable people, exploitation of land and people, labor, water. People are driven out of their country by gangs, by cartels, by the inability to sustain their families. And that is why people come. And because the social fabric doesn't exist anymore to hold them, or to hold the helpful projects that I used to see when I worked in Chiapas, because so many people, the brightest and the best and the most able-bodied, are leaving their countries, and a lot of other people, there's just not people to sustain positive action on the other side of the border with our neighbors. So we must be the ones who act. And you have as a church. So I'm going to turn the mic over to our two friends who were on the journey 2.5 years ago. This is the first time that they've talked about it publicly. So just notice the tenderness that goes with that.
Good morning. Let me tell you about our very first day. This was a rich and life-changing journey. I think you'll understand why. It was an overcast Sunday afternoon. We were led through the desert that was traveled by so many migrants with their quest for a better life. This was led by Pastor Randy Meyer and a volunteer from the Green Valley Samaritans. Believe me, this is unforgiving terrain. Dry, windy, challenging, stony ravines, huge swaths covered by cactus just waiting to jump on a leg with piercing needles. As one looks out, it becomes quickly evident, next slide, that it's very difficult to get a sense of direction or orientation. It's almost impossible. The days can be unbearably hot, the nights very cold. Most traveling are coming with the smallest amount of food and water. During some of the worst times, please hear this, Border Patrol helicopters flew very low during the night, stirring up the sand and the cactus debris, forcing migrants to fall to the ground, terrifying, lose their vision, lose their sense of any kind of safety they may have. It was an overwhelming, massive place, and there were very few signs, if any, of welcome. We came across several painted crosses marking the spots where innocents met with their death. Close by, please notice a solitary tennis shoe, a jacket, a decomposing backpack, often a rosary. As we ended this long hike, Pastor Randy led us in a song. Here are the words. Framing laws and aiming guns keeps you down and on the run. How will you feed your little ones? Who's the criminal now?
I want to talk a little bit about the efficient way our government processed illegal aliens. It was called Operation Streamline. If a migrant is caught entering the U.S. anywhere except at an official point of entry, their arrest is immediate. We visited a courtroom where a judge, a retired judge, out of retirement to help his colleagues, was presiding over Operation Streamline, where about 75 men and women had been arrested for entering the country illegally. In 5-point shackles, so wrists, ankles, and around, all held together like that, in groups of and usually, so one hand maybe with a translator and the other holding their pants up because their belts had been taken away. A group of about 10 migrants lined up, eyes down, and one at a time answered 3 questions, 3 yes or no questions, each requiring a 1-word answer. All pled guilty. And unless they were a repeat offender, each was sentenced to be returned immediately to Mexico. The whole process of justice took about 40 minutes. Afterwards, this retired judge talked to our group and a few other groups that were there as well. Answered questions. He was a patient and amiable man, pretty direct. And I don't remember the question, but I remember the answer that he gave us at one point. He says, well, we're a country good at punishment.
Migrants on their long journey of hope are aware of the presence of cartels as they near the border. There are at least 7 major cartels in Mexico, essentially organized large gangs set up to gain power and profit in particular regions. They're not infrequently aided, working hand in hand with the local officials, and always enabled by the knowledge that their crimes may not be prosecuted. The cartels prey on these desperate ones looking for asylum. Migrants frequently find themselves dependent upon cartel members known as coyotes for passage. Sadly, this is all too often a hugely expensive service that provides little more than the illusion of assistance or protection.
We visited shelters in Nogales and Agua Prieta, Mexico. Simple open buildings, crowded, mattresses on the floor, children clinging to their parents' legs. We met people who had left behind all they owned except what they could carry, who had literally fled for their lives, fearful, exhausted, careful, yet at the same time hopeful, waiting for their number to be called, risking everything for a chance at a better life, waiting for their number to be called. So that was, there were thousands of people, if you add up all of the shelters like that along the border. And when we were there, maybe 5 to 10 or 15 people a day were being let through and being allowed to seek asylum, apply for asylum. Afterwards, when we asked, in these conversations, we asked, what message would you like us to bring back? What would you like people to know about you? And the answer again was pretty simple. That we are good people. That we, the asylum seekers, are good people.
For over a decade, people have gathered every Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. at the Douglas, Arizona border to remember the countless many who have lost their lives crossing the desert in this hope of asylum. Next slide, please. Next. Okay. It's a cold and very windy evening as 80 or so of us stand in a circle to begin the vigil. Nearby, a large wagon holding over 300 white crosses inscribed with the names, dates of birth of those found, and sometimes only the dates when the remains were found. Some read unidentified. These crosses represent only a mere fraction of the people who died in this area alone. Next slide. We begin walking in a line, each of us carrying 2 crosses. The direction of the line turns. The first marcher steps down from the curb, holds high the cross, and announces the name of the deceased. The response is a loud, resounding presente, calling forth the soul of the deceased to be present, remembered, and honored. Each cross, next slide, is respectfully set up right on the curb for all to see as a poignant memorial. The wind blows colder. Our hearts were open wide. In a circle we sing. We remember, we pray, and we weep.
Just a few words about the wall. I'd heard about Trump's wall, the wall that Mexico was going to pay for, the wall that would never get funded and built, right? But when I got there, I still wasn't prepared for what I saw. 30 feet tall. So I don't know if you can get a feel for 30 feet tall. I'm a pretty big man. So stack what, 5 of me, and that's the height. Topped with razor wire, stretching for 450 miles. That wall that was never going to get built. Sometimes cutting through the most desolate desert imaginable, and other times cutting right through border towns, cutting right through Agua Prieta, Sonora, Douglas, in half, cutting them in half. Ugly, oppressive, sad, and not a solution. I want to say, am I the wrap up here? So ugly, oppressive, sad. I don't want to leave you with those words. At another facility, an administrator who talked to us when asked about her solution to the immigration crisis, admitted to not knowing, but said that still she wasn't going to hold back, and her words stuck with me. She said, "There will always be new problems created by how we fix the old ones. But absent the clarity of perfection, I will attend to what's in front of me and hope to err on the side of compassion."
Oh, boy. Thank you. I just want to say that wall now has 3 rows of the razor wire, and people still jump it. Hospital in San Diego in the last year alone has seen 345 people who have jumped through the razor wire. We've seen some of them come through Casalitas. You don't want to see that.
So not to get your hopes up too high, but on a slightly more hopeful note, when we got back, we felt we had to do something. I mean, hopefully you can see and feel what we felt at the end of this trip, and that we felt we had to do something. So we contacted Delle and said, is there something we can do to actually make a positive contribution in this situation? And she said, well, there's a little town about 60 miles west of Tucson called Sonoita, and they have a shelter that was abandoned, half constructed. And if you could raise the money to send them, they have the men who would be living in this shelter, who are currently living in arroyos outside the town. But they would, if they had a shelter that they could live in, then they will build it. And so Plymouth took that on, and we were successful in raising the money needed for the materials. And this is just a couple of shots of what we were able to do for the people in this little town. So this was the shelter that they had half built. So you can see that it's gravel floor. There are actually 2 walls that are built at this point, no ceiling. Okay. And at this point, there were 150 men living in this shelter, in addition to one living outside of it. Excuse me. So it was a situation that just cried out to be remedied. So with the materials that we were able to send them, the men who were living there then took on the task of building the shelter. We worked with a group in Arizona that delivered the materials and helped supervise some of the work, but the men actually had their own crew chiefs and did the work. Notice we're not showing faces to protect the people involved, but here are the men laying the roof of their shelter. Next slide, please. So here's the inside. We now have a roof. We don't have a floor yet, but we do have a roof. We have windows. They haven't had windows before, so life is getting slowly better. Voila, concrete floor. So much better. They are much happier. And last slide. So this is what it looks like from the outside now, a little more like a home and a little less like an open air gravel pit. So, and dogs. Life is complete. This helped us, pardon the pun, but this really helped us feel like we had done something real and concrete to help in this situation. And for many of us, it just was something that was very needful. The immigrants were proud that they finished the shelter themselves, and we're very grateful to us for the opportunity to do so.
And you raised $12,000 to do it. Yeah. So it's your turn now. There's time for questions and hopefully some answers, maybe more questions. Right? Are you gonna?
No questions online yet. Anybody have a question?
And while we're waiting for hands raised, thank you for the folks who are online watching this. We're so glad that you're here too. Now, did you have a question?
Yes, I'll take advantage of the fact that I'm holding the mic. What's the situation with Section 42 now? I know there have been requests for it to be eliminated.
Be struck down. It hasn't yet, and they keep saying that it's going to be, and we gear up for it. I don't know how we could gear up more, frankly. I mean, 900 people in a day is impossible, and our staff is stretched to, the extreme, and so are volunteers. But Title 42 has meant that the border, all along the border on the Mexico side, has become a pressure cooker because all of these people are waiting to cross legally to seek asylum, waiting for Title 42 to be lifted. When that happens, there will be many more people. We will begin to see people from Mexico, Chiapas, Guerrero, other states in Mexico and in Central America. They are generally darker skinned people, and the politics of this country is very fearful of that. So we're waiting. People have had babies and gotten married and died on the other side of the border. The group that's coming in February will go down to the new Casa de Misericordia. It's not a new building. It used to be part of Borderlinks, but it's about an 8-acre site that is able to hold more people. And during COVID, they had 200 people there for the whole 2 years of COVID before they could start crossing with the help of attorneys. So people who are in really hard situations with the help of attorneys can cross, but very, very few people have been allowed to cross since Title 42 went into place. So they're waiting, and they are prey to the cartels on the other side of the border. It's very hard for them to get work, as you can imagine. And many of them have gone home and are waiting at home, but still there's a lot of people on the other side of the border waiting to cross. And many go ahead and cross, quote, illegally. They should be able to ask for asylum, but they come through areas that aren't official ports of entry, and they're deported right away. Yeah. There was maybe a question in the back. I'm not sure. Oh, there is a question in the back, the other side. Well, how about you come up here? Well, is this good? Okay. Yep.
Question?
There's one. So he was also, oh, right. And then you, and then you. Okay.
Okay. Early on, I think you said that companies went from the United States to Mexico and started businesses in Mexico, or I think you maybe mentioned a McDonald's or something. And you said that somehow affected the people wanting to
Yeah.
come to the US.
Yeah.
Could you explain that?
Yeah, when the
that
free
was-
trade agreement went into effect, one of the conditions for it to go into effect on the Mexico side was that indigenous land called ejido land, which up to that time, 1997, people could not sell their indigenous land. So they couldn't break up a big, what we would call reservation here, but a big area of indigenous land. But with the free trade agreement, they had to change their constitution so that native land could be sold. So what happened was people who, a child would break an arm or there would be a necessity, they would sell their little piece of land. And so big agribusiness moved in, huge swaths of lands taken over by international corporations, agribusiness. So those people were literally, forced off of their land. And generally they went to the maquiladoras, the factories, often geared towards young folks who had good hand-eye coordination, et cetera. And usually their health was ruined within a couple of years because of the conditions they worked. So people began to get smart and go farther looking for work that would pay, that they could send money home. But also the development that needed to happen, the infrastructure of roads and wires and all of that, so that big corporate business, international business, could move down there and exploit. Chiapas, where I lived, is one of the areas that, with major natural resources and labor, cheap labor. So that has been exploited. Almost all the waterways in Mexico dams have been made for hydroelectric power for the US, not for Mexico. So that's just a small number. It also cut all social support. So public schools, public health, all of those things were, just as that's happening in the United States now, were no longer funded by the government. Everything was privatized so that people who were living on a very, very minimal wage had no way of getting education or physical and mental health. Yeah.
Okay.
So also a question in the back and up here, and then we'll go back to the back.
Just wondering.
Let's use the mic for.
I'm just wondering, and this may not be on point for your presentation, but politically, what is the reality of both political power parties coming to some solution for this issue? Because what I've heard in the media is that both parties uses this issue as a way to attack the other party.
Since Biden has taken office, 1,000 remains have been found in the Sonora Desert. There's still a flood south to north of people. So I think that, and certainly during the Obama administration, there was a lot of criticism of Obama for immigration policies that were put forth in his administration. And basically we found before the election, when the Biden administration sent folks down, before he was elected, but to see what we needed on the border, we were really clear of how we needed to make a safety zone on the border for people to enter the United States safely and leave safely. People don't want to come here and stay here. They want to come and earn some money and then go back to their countries. But the big economy is around border, quote, protection, right? Border security. And there's so much money being made off of keeping migrants out. And then once they're in, keeping them quiet, right? If they're undocumented, and asylum seekers may not get work permits for years. So they have to work under the table. And if they work under the table for cash and they're caught, then they're immediately deported. So I don't see any hope of the two political parties coming together with some action. I mean, DACA, the Dreamers, that's a really good thing. I think that was started in the Obama administration. That's still holding, but our Supreme Court can strike that down, at any minute. So some of the progress that we made is being halted. Right.
I'm curious to know what actually activities occur when you cross the border to help with the people there. You talked about the water barrels. Are there other things that you're doing, and or what is the relationship with the Border Patrol with regard to that?
There's several groups that are really active on the border. Well, three I'll name is No More Deaths, which is generally young, hot-headed, idealist folks that come down. I want to say kids. I don't mean that disparagingly, but they're much younger than I am. And they have a camp in the desert, and we don't cross the border. We stay on the US side of the border to do our work. And they are the ones that are, well, I'd say most of us break laws in order to save lives. But No More Deaths have been brought up on trial, for decisions that they've made to transport people. And so that's No More Deaths. That's one of them. They go out into the desert. They put water bottles out. Humane Borders, I told you about, puts the water barrels out, which is a big operation to try to get water to these different, very remote locations. And they also do the counting of remains, of going out and looking for people. They get calls all the time saying, we haven't seen one, he's totally disappeared. And so folks go out in the desert and look for where they think he may have been the last time they saw him. And there's the Samaritans both in Tucson and Green Valley. And we go out in vehicles and also on foot and walk paths. And we're seeing more, quote, illegal crossing these days, more traffic. That had certainly waned during COVID and during the Trump administration. But those are three. And then many of us work on both sides of the border. I've toured Mexico and worked in shelters all across Mexico. And in fact, saw that Mexico churches had shelters and we didn't, and came back and I said, why don't we have shelters in the US? And 3 weeks later, we had the opportunity to open one in our church. So be careful what you ask for, right? But yeah, there's a lot of organizations that are doing great work on the border, and those are a few of them. That's just in the Tucson sector. There's others in Southern California and in Texas that are working as well. And then a lot of shelters on both sides of the border. Border Patrol. There's nobody in charge. I mean, during the Trump administration, they did away with a lot of the infrastructure to support the moving of migrants, to bring them to our shelter, the buses, that brought them to the different shelters. All of that was done away with. All the contractors who'd bring people to us, for instance. So when Biden took over, there was none of that. We had to hustle to get our own transportation. Border Patrol is made up primarily of folks who come back from the Iraq, Afghanistan, different serving in the military, and have that mentality of doing the job and keeping the law of the land. I think there's a lot of good people on Border Patrol, and it's still a kind of a herd mentality, and there's great cruelty that is documented in the hands of Border Patrol. Customs and Border Enforcement is the other group. In the treatment of migrants. Yes.
I heard about this maybe a year or so ago, and I don't know very much, but I heard that one of our largest drug companies went into Mexico to start manufacturing drugs in Mexico because it is easier for them to be stolen and taken over by the cartels and mixing the illegal drug in it, the drugs that are killing us so many people every day today. Do you know anything about that?
Oh, I haven't heard that. I haven't heard that drug companies have gone to Mexico. I mean, they certainly did when labor was cheaper there, and we certainly did exploit indigenous information about what plants in the jungle make for really good medicine, but no cooperation with cartels or anything like that.
Well,
And I want to, if you don't mind, I want to move on because
Okay,
some
sure,
folks on this side,
sure.
maybe who haven't. Hello. Somebody who hasn't asked a question?
Ask number one, I have two small things. One, where can we get a shirt like that? That's great.
I think it was from the Ignatian Solidarity Network online.
Say it again.
Ignatian Solidarity.
Okay, okay. The second thing is I live in Germany part of the time. I'm a Minnesotan. I grew up in Albert Lee. I just don't get it because Germans are so much better to migrants. I mean, it's a tiny country and they've just opened their arms and given them health
Oh, I
care
see.
and everything.
Yep.
I just don't
Yep.
get it.
Yep. They don't have as polarized, yeah, they do have as polarized political parties as we do now. So I think that, yeah. I'm gonna say one more thing, that one more way you can help that's been really wonderful for this church is the Just Coffee sales. There's a cooperative in Chiapas, which is a state that sent so many indigenous people in situations of forced migration north. But this coffee cooperative grows, roasts, and sells their own coffee. There's absolutely no middle person. This isn't free trade coffee or just whatever. It is absolutely they're in control of the entire process. And you order how many hundreds of dollars a time? At least $1,000 is their biggest order that they get. So they send it from Mexico and it's fabulous coffee and it's maybe $11 a pound. So ask and beef that order up because not one person in that cooperative has migrated north. Which is great.
We have a hand for our presenter.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Just Coffee has a table out in Jones Commons. If you want to sign up to get some, you can. Also, it's available to be drunk out of the coffee dispensers in Jones Commons, so you can try before you buy. Just one last comment before we go. Next week, we have Paul Huffman, who is the League of Women Voters Redistricting Coordinator, and he'll be talking about what happened in the last voting redistricting, and what happens now. So please come next week.